You are listening to Data Decoded, a podcast from the Data Justice Hub at Concordia University.
We are a collaborative project aiming to understand how activists gather and make sense of data.
Want to learn how activists are using data to fight evictions and how to use data to push universities to stop investing in fossil fuels?
In this new series, we find out what drives activists and how they use data to further their cause. We find out how data activists work to make the world a fairer place.
To listen to their stories and more, tune in to Data Decoded, wherever you get your podcasts. This episode, we have the privilege to speak with Dr. William Carroll, a professor in sociology at the University of Victoria, regarding his work with the Corporate Mapping Project, which is dedicated to exposing the power and influence of the fossil fuel industry on Canadian society. Specifically, the Corporate Mapping Project is invested in conducting research to understand the Organization of Canada's Fossil Power Top 50, our most powerful organizations contributing to the climate change crisis right under our nose.
We will be asking Bill to explain how public institutions in Canada are being influenced by executives previously employed in the oil and gas sectors.
Right. Well, if we take it way back, I started working in this field on my dissertation back in the late 1970s. So I've done a lot of work on corporate power and trying to map out structures of corporate power using primarily data from corporate annual reports that are publicly available, and looking at who serves on the boards of directors of large corporations and who are the top executives of those corporations, and then matching up the names across corporations to construct the network of interlocking corporate directorates. So we can, in that way, look at the elite network of the largest corporations and get a sense of how corporate power is socially organized. So I've been doing this work, since the 1970s. But the Corporate Mapping Project got started in 2013, and it's been a partnership with the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, particularly the BC branch, at the centre as a really key partner, and then the University of Victoria as the sponsoring academic institution. And then a number of other NGOs and also a major union, Unifor, also as partners, as well as half a dozen other universities. So we developed this partnership beginning in 2013. The project itself got funded and started up in 2015. And we started systematically mapping out the power structure of particularly the fossil fuel industry in Canada, but extending it to other industries in Canada and also extending it to other corporations outside of Canada. So we gradually sort of snowball the network from an initial core of the major fossil fuel companies that are based in Canada, and then look at which companies they are connected to and which companies their neighbors are connected to. And we, in that way, build out the network overall, both on a national and global basis, and looking into how other sectors tie into the network. For example, the financial sector is deeply connected with the fossil fuel sector in Canada and funds it, right? So we can sort of expose those relationships by systematically collecting the data and collating it and then analyzing it using social network analysis. Now, the Corporate Mapping Project, that's been a fairly core interest, but we also have been interested in other forms of corporate power as they reach into the state and civil society. And so we've looked at quite a range of institutions and organizations and networks that all tend to secure and amplify the power of the fossil fuel sector in political life and cultural life within Canada in particular.
The Corporate Mapping Project aims to expose the problematic fossil fuel practices of large corporations across Canada, Dr. Bill Carroll, the project's co-director, is one of many people involved in organizing the team of academics, researchers, and activists who engage with collecting the project's data.
Yeah, well, I mean, at the highest level, if you like, of analysis or thinking, it's really a kind of enlightenment perspective. That is to say that in order to actually have a democratic, a modern democratic social order, people need to be informed and knowledgeable. And one of the problems we face is that really there's corporate control of information and state control of information that really limits the extent to which people can grasp the situation that we're actually in, which makes it very difficult for a democratic way of life to really be sustained. So, I mean, clearly we need as much knowledge that exposes the power relations that actually exist in our society as possible, so that people can understand the need for greater democratization, particularly of economic relations and economic decision making. And so, you know, I see it in those terms, that it's primarily about consciousness raising and providing people with the information that enables them to understand the actual structure of power. The image that most people have is that we live in a market society and the markets rationally decide what's optimally best, right? What product to to produce and to consume and so on and so forth. And all of that is, of course, a kind of corporate propaganda. When we really look at the market system, we see that there are a very small number of corporations that control most of the action. The rest of the players are subordinate to them, and that includes states. And so, we need a research strategy that clarifies the actual situation, and that that requires a lot of digging and data collection and data analysis to present reliable information, and then try to get that information out there, because that's the other problem. As I mentioned, there's corporate control not only of economic relations but of the media. And so we've partnered with a number of really good alternative media that do excellent investigative journalism, and some of them have become quite active within the Corporate Mapping Project, and we've done various collaborative work with them, including the National Observer and the Tyee and the Narwhal, for example, as well as the Breach. And so, I think one of the interesting things in Canada is that there are these openings in terms of, and not just Canada, but the development of alternative media, because it's not that expensive to do online media, and you can do really good work that certainly rivals corporate media like the Globe and Mail in terms of the number of awards that these investigative journalists at places like the National Observer pick up. They're basically comparable to the Globe and Mail. So, I think it's that kind of thing. We're trying to map corporate power and get the word out there to various publics, including activist publics, so that they can do the work that they need to do in trying to democratize, really, which is very much a matter of getting information out to people. Yeah, well, when I was a graduate student, a professor, a sociologist at University of Oregon, Val Burris is his name. He, well, not all the way back then, but not that long after, he established a website and has done an enormous amount of work on mapping corporate power. And so that served as a kind of inspiration to me to say that, we really can get this information out to the public. But the basic tool that Val used and that I've used is social network analysis. And that's a form of analysis in social science that goes back a ways in the 20th century. and that has developed as a way of really mapping out social relations in a systematic manner that provide pictures of, what organizations or individuals are at the center of networks, which are the major cohesive sub-networks or groups within networks that hang together cohesively in terms of having a lot of relations with each other. So you can sort of dissect a network once you've gathered the data. So the first step, of course, is to gather the data. And in that case, it depends on what you're trying to look at. For example, in the corporate mapping project, as I mentioned, we've done a lot of research on interlocking directorates. So in that case, you would gather data on who sits on the boards of different corporations and other organizations. For example, we've looked at neoliberal think tanks and industry groups and business councils, like the Canadian Council of Chief Executives, or now named the Business Council of Canada, and other groups like that, including university boards of governors and various research institutes that are housed in universities. They all have their boards of directors, and you can sort of see the influence of the fossil fuel industry by noticing how people who are directors of fossil fuel corporations also sit on these other boards, whether it's the University of Calgary School of Public Policy, or the University of Alberta Board of Governors. It's basically a matter of systematically gathering the data and then looking at collating it into a kind of big spreadsheet, if you like, and then analyzing it using social network analysis algorithms. But as I say, it's possible to do this with other data. For example, we've done a lot of research as well on lobbying. It turns out that most of the provinces, as well as the federal government, maintain these lobbyist directories, and it's publicly available information. You can go to the lobbyist directory and get information on who is lobbying each branch of government, and you can basically, what we did is connect those data up with our corporate data to really map out the network of the major corporations and industry groups like the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers that are engaged in really extensive lobbying relations with the government, whether at the provincial level or the federal level. So our study of the federal level, we found that, I think, as I recall, the fossil fuel industry was meeting with government officials, whether elected or top senior servants, civil servants. They were meeting an average of 6 times per business day throughout the last few years, including the last years of the Harper administration, as well as the first few years of the Trudeau administration. There's no real change over time. It's a kind of deep state phenomenon where the industry is always lobbying all the time. Doesn't matter what the government is. Now you might say, well, they're lobbying, but nobody listens to them. But actually, most of the asks that the industry has are taken up by the state, and we've shown that as well. So these relationships have real clout, and I could go on. Like we've looked at funding relationships involving major private foundations and how they fund various NGOs, environmental NGOs, to sort of torque the Canadian NGO network in a business-friendly direction. So there's a lot that you can do with publicly available information that maps out these various structures of corporate power and influence. And that's been one of our key strategies in the corporate mapping project. I can't think of a particular accomplishment that I'm particularly proud of, but I do take some pride in fighting the good fight, which is, I think, what we're doing. Yeah, but I think it is helpful in sort of concretizing, the key culprits, and then spinning off of that, we organized a lot of workshops for NGOs that we did mostly on Zoom, partly because of the pandemic. Some were done in person early on, and these workshops, were about how to study corporate power and sort of laying out, various kinds of methods and telling them the story of the Corporate Mapping Project, of course, and the resources that we've developed, but also looking at trying to provide advice as to how people can do this kind of research. So that workshop, I think, is also available.
The numbers the Corporate Mapping Project have been able to gather are astounding. According to their website, the full CMP database documents 1,656 organizations, 44,433 people, and tracks 53,225 relations between them, and is current to 2017.
Yeah, that's why I say you need to have some connection, like even if it's just a friend, or a colleague at a university who has an account, then you can actually get access. So it's not so much reputational, it's a matter of having a university affiliation. And at UVic, I as a professor, I have the power to nominate people to become associates of University of Victoria. And I've done that pretty extensively in the Corporate Mapping Project to enable some community-based researchers to access those databases. So that's possible to do. And I think strategically it's important that academically based researchers do that kind of thing to enable people who otherwise would not have access. Yeah. Well, I think the industry has been, paying attention to the Corporate Mapping Project from the start. Actually, when we were launching the project, I can't divulge the details because they're confidential, but some major industry groups approached the University of Victoria, and they were clearly, trying to, well, if not shut it down, I would say influence the actual shape and form that this project would take. And to its credit, our university administration basically refused that offer. So I think, as I say, it's hard to say what kind of impact we've had. I think it has been just part of a process of trying to raise public consciousness and build capacity within progressive NGOs for not just resisting corporate power, but trying to present alternatives, particularly to the fossil capitalist scenario that we're in right now. And so over time, and this was our plan actually from the start of the Corporate Mapping Project, we've gradually been moving from sort of outing the oligarchy type strategies to presenting alternatives. And so we've been working with, for example, the what's it called? The indigenous climate. Indigenous climate. I'm having trouble remembering the name of this group, but they're an incredibly important group in Canada that we've been working with, and they've been developing an Indigenous critique of the federal government climate plan, but as a second stage, they're now developing an Indigenous alternative. And so that's an important development. Indigenous Climate Action is the name of the group. But then we've also been a group of corporate mapping collaborators and really core team members, including Emily Eaton at University of Regina and Angel Aluk at York University, and several other people are co-authoring a book which is, again, presenting a kind of just transition alternative to the status quo. that really takes decolonization seriously as one of the absolutely crucial aspects of any transition out of fossil capitalism. So, I would say the agenda for us, we're continuing to map the power, but we've also been sort of shifting into this more proactive sense of, trying to provide some vision and strategy for a different future. Yeah, I think people can take action in their workplaces and communities. It's the Corporate Mapping Project is very much about knowledge and power, but of course a lot of the action is more practical action. Pushing for free public transit. There's so many different angles on this in terms of the multifaceted nature of the crisis and the solutions that have to come at different levels, local right up to global. And so, I mean, for me, it does come down to thinking about democratization and how to really democratize the various spaces that we're in as we live our lives, and that certainly includes moving away from the corporate form of economic organization toward economic democracy. And so unions are very important as democratizing structures within workplaces. But, obviously people can be involved in various NGOs are doing excellent work in resisting corporate power, exposing corporate power, and so on. So there are political parties that are not terribly great, but not, I would say the NDPs and the NDP and the Greens are at least in some ways addressing some of the important issues. So there's lots of course, there's groups like the Council of Canadians that have very broad kinds of mandates and interests, certainly including issues of climate justice. And so, I would say, to someone who's just starting out, take your pick, find an organization or a group that you can work with well and that's doing good work, and just get involved.
Social networking is fundamental to the success of the team's data collection. The project, which remains Canada-wide, is based at the University of Victoria in Victoria, British Columbia, and identifies big money Canadian corporations that are well known to the Canadian public. These include RBC, TransCanada, or even academic institutions like the University of Alberta in Edmonton, Alberta. They have identified the largest contributors to the fossil fuel industry via the Fossil Power Top 50 list, which categorizes the legitimators, the emitters, and the enablers.
Yeah, the Fossil Power Top 50 was a really, I think, useful thing to put out there, because it's on our website. So if you go to corporatemapping.ca and just click on the database, you'll get to a number of interconnected websites that provide information that you can actually, look up a corporation and see how it's situated in the larger elite network that I was describing earlier, including not just Canadian corporations, but also American corporations. And that was all done in collaboration with our partner, Little Sis, which does excellent work in corporate mapping within the United States, using, big data, a lot more information than we've used in the corporate mapping project. But the Fossil Power Top 50, I mean, we sort of thought about how can we really put the message out there in a way that is accessible to people and not overwhelming in terms of the details. And so that's why we centered on the top 50. And these are not just corporations, but other organizations as well. And what we did was we developed a kind of case study of each of these corporations and organizations as the key culprits, if you like, in terms of the carbon emissions and the contribution to the climate crisis that Canada is making, which is a pretty major contribution, unfortunately. And so, it was a matter of thinking that through, okay, what if you really want to identify the 50 major players in this, who might they be, and of course, with the business press, like say the Financial Post or Fortune magazine, every year they publish their Fortune 500, let's say. And so that's not that difficult to do, because you just take the 500 largest corporations in terms of their total revenue or whatever metric you want to use. But in this case, we're doing something a little bit different. And so we wanted to identify, not just the largest corporations, but the real key influencers in various ways and the key enablers of fossil capitalism in Canada. So that involved really getting together and discussing, things theoretically and strategically. What if we look at this picture, who are the key players that really are sustaining this regime of obstruction in Canada? And so, of course, the major corporations that are directly extracting carbon and emitting carbon into the atmosphere are on our list, but we also have what we call enablers, namely the financial institutions and institutional investors that are heavily financing the industry in Canada, as well as, of course, the captured state regulators that are rubber stamping new projects, right? And so, when you start thinking about the 50 top, players, you can begin to, think about, well, okay, how does this process actually work? What are the organizations that are really pushing forward the agenda and maintaining the status quo of business as usual? And then we have a category of legitimators, which is pretty diverse, but includes a lot of ideological legitimation for the industry through think tanks and other organizations of that sort. And so, it's a diverse group, the top 50, when we look at it that way. It was interesting researching them. In that case, you have to sort of go to websites and try to look at, okay, what can we learn about this group? Who's really in charge of it? Who's on the board of directors again? And how can we map all of that out? So there was a lot of intensive, really case study research involved in putting that fossil power 50 together.
As they are linking the fossil fuel industry to other sectors of the Canadian economy, they are clearly designating the problematic arenas of fossil fuel influences in think tanks and lobbying across Canada.
Proud of? Well, I can't think of a moment that I'm particularly proud of. I mean, I think it's just it's a bit like trench warfare. Like we're in the trenches, we're trying to make some progress and move forward, but it doesn't seem as if we're moving forward very quickly, I'd say. I mean, clearly we need to be realistic. The powers that we're up against are very entrenched, to continue with the warfare metaphor. They have their trenches and they're really ensconced and protecting their turf quite effectively. So, I mean, that's the kind of struggle that we're in, and Corporate Mapping Project has just been, one player in an overall kind of what's sometimes called a war of position to try to win the hearts and minds of the public.
To follow our upcoming episodes, stay tuned wherever you get your podcasts. To learn more about the Corporate Mapping Project's activities and their further research interests, visit their website at corporatemapping.ca.